You know, Gail had said to me, it's a July 4th holiday. You don't want to do the lecture on July 4th, do you? And I said, no, we do. It's really one of my favorite holidays, so I'm so glad that we're here. Please join with me. Let's take a deep breath. We see in the middle of our mind a little ball of golden light, and we watch this light as it begins to grow, larger and larger, until now it covers the entire inner vision of our mind. And we see for ourselves within this light a beautiful temple. We see a garden that surrounds the temple and a body of water that flows through the garden. We see that the inside of the temple is lit as well by this same beautiful golden light. And here we are. For we have been drawn together by the power and in the presence of God. We devote our time spent together, all of our relationships to one another, to Him. And we pray that His Holy Spirit be upon us. And tonight, particularly, dear God, upon our nation. And we pray to be lifted up above and beyond the turmoil in our hearts, in our country, and in our world, to the endless love and peace that lay beyond. And so it is. Together, we all say, amen. I saw a news item on television earlier today about a mural that was painted in Brooklyn. And it took the famous painting, the iconic painting that I think is in Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but it painted different pictures. Instead of all being the white men who were actually there were different sexes and genders and ethnic groups, and those representing what America is today, signing the Declaration of Independence and with the same body language and so forth, which I thought was a beautiful symbol for the meaning of this day. Several of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Madison talked about this, Adams talked about this, how ultimately even the Constitution itself would mean nothing if it was not alive in the hearts of the people. And John Adams spoke about how he hoped that July 4th would be a day when we would, as a nation, generation after generation, revisit our first principles. I want to begin tonight by reading to you from a letter. Now, it was actually on July 2nd, 1776, when independence from England was formally declared, and July 4th was the day it actually went to the printer and was then distributed. That I find interesting for the astrologers in the crowd. So the birthday became officially July 4th, but actually July 2nd was the day of the ultimate declaration, and then codified in the printing in July 4th. So this letter was written July 3rd, and it's a famous letter from John Adams to his wife, Abigail. And this is from that letter. The second day of July, 1776, will be the most memorable epocha in the history of America. I am apt to believe that it will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. You will think me, he said, transported with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. Yet, through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. Now, both Adams and Jefferson, as many of you are probably aware, but some of you probably not, 50 years afterwards, on July 4th, 1826, on that day, both Adams and Jefferson died. Now, during the time of the Revolution, Adams and Jefferson were very good friends, and then they became rather bitter rivals. Adams feeling very, very strongly about centralized federal power, and Jefferson feeling very, very strongly about the decentralization and the power of the states. But after the revolutionary generation, the generation of the founders had had their main times in actual political power, those two men having been separated as they were by their political rivalry, Adams wrote Jefferson a letter, and he said, "Let us not die without having explained ourselves to one another. After that, they began a series of letters. They became very, very good friends, and then they both died on the same day, 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But even that is very interesting, because Adams died in Massachusetts. Jefferson died several hours later in Virginia. Now, Adams, his final words were, even though his final words were, Jefferson still survives. Jefferson's last words were, is it the fourth yet? Now, it's interesting because historians say that Adams simply had it wrong, but metaphysicians say, no, he didn't have it wrong. We don't know what he saw when he said Jefferson still survives. So any way you look at the story, it is redolent with imagery and drama and a fantastic quality. Now, whether it is an individual or a nation, if you don't have principles that guide your life, you are guided by mere appetite. Whether you're an individual or a nation, if you don't have principles on which you base your attitudes, your energies, your efforts, your sense of mission on this earth, then you are lacking a headlight. You are lacking any sense of meaning and ultimate purpose. And what has happened in our generation is that even though we continue generation after generation to replay the same contests that were established with those founding generations and their aftermath, too many Americans, not having studied civics, not having studied history, those things, and too often no longer even being in the curricula for too many children in the United States, or too many of us having been taught those principles by perhaps board teachers in whatever way, and for whatever reason, it not having stuck. Too many of us do not have the kind of heart connection to these first principles that are embossed within the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And as the founder said, you can't have that. It's just a piece of paper unless people are holding these things in their hearts. So we are actually seeing in our time today, for instance, Adams being really big on federal power, Jefferson being really big on the decentralization and state power. These are the exact contests that we are waging today. And I mean literally today. The President Trump, having set up a commission, he says, to fight voter fraud, and saying that he wanted all of the states to give up voter ID info, your name and your social security number and your voting history and all of that. And we now have over 40, it's moving towards more than 40 secretaries of state around the country, one of whom, not only who said hell no, but one of whom said go jump in the Mississippi before I will give this to you. So, but my point here, whichever side you feel is right on this issue, this is a contest still being waged. In the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, for instance, the states have the right to oversee elections. That's what those Secretary of States were saying. Why they have the right to say to the federal government, no, we will not turn this over. In the 2000 election, the state of Florida, the Supreme Court of Florida said, in response to the drama happening between Bush and Gore, the state of Florida said, we are going to recount the votes. Then the Supreme Court of the United States, and what many see as an unconstitutional move of judicial activism, then overrode the state of Florida and made the decision that they made. So these contests are still being waged today. And too many Americans, it seems to me, unless we know what these principles are and what these great contests signify, we don't know how to participate. This is what makes politics a spectator sport. It's like if you go to a hockey game for the first time with a friend, you go to a soccer game for the first time, the friend will say, okay, let me tell you how the game is played, let me tell you what the rules are. If nobody tells you what the rules of hockey, you're gonna have a pretty boring time at the game. Nobody tells you the rules of soccer, you're gonna have a really boring time at the game. You gotta know what the rules are. Okay, who are the players and what are they doing? And then you're participatory and you're shouting and you're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And that's how politics is. It is particularly important, however, because if the American people fail to know what these principles are, we lack the power, we lack the necessary information with which to participate, making us spectator sports, and as the more and more we become spectators to our own governance in a free society, the more vulnerable we are to the very forces that actually mitigate against freedom and democracy. greedy Caesars and tyrannous kings have always been with us. And greedy Caesars and tyrannous kings will not be gone from the earth until they are gone from our heads. So what happens with the greedy Caesars and the tyrannous kings is just like any symptom of any disease. If it is not ultimately dealt with on the causal level, its symptom will merely morph. If you know the larger game, and you know the larger context of history, then you see a greedy Caesar and you see a tyrannous king, and you know, don't make it about the greedy Caesar and the tyrannous king, because this ain't nothing new. And so you know not only what is actually happening on a causal level, but you know you have the navigational tools, you have the principles with which to override that which you do not wish to have. Now, these first principles of the United States that are entrenched in our Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution are spiritual in nature. Our founders knew that. Our founders said that. The irony here is lost on no student of history. You have these men who signed these documents, and by the way, it's worth mentioning that in doing so, they were risking their lives. There was no guarantee that this war was going to go well. And if they had been caught by George III, either during the war or if the war had not ended as we wished, they would have been tried and clearly killed for treason. They were committing an act of treason by signing this. As a matter of fact, we all know the story of John Hancock, why his handwriting is so big. You know why John Hancock wrote his handwriting so big? Because during the lead up to that time, John Hancock was a real rabble-rouser, but he was a successful guy. So the agents of the British government had said to John Hancock, look, here's some money, why don't you just give up all this independence talk, give up all this revolutionary stuff. And what did they call, by the way, the revolutionaries at that time, the revolutionary generation? Insurgents. Heard that word before? So they said to John Hancock, here's some money, why don't you just kind of get out of town and stop all this rabble-rousing? John Hancock signed his handwriting so big on the Declaration of Independence because he wanted to make sure that George saw, this is me, I'm here. I love these little personal stories from history. Now, these were white men, all of them, and some of them were slave owners. So they wrote a Declaration of Independence in which it is said that all men are created equal. That's the basis of our whole idea of the repudiation of aristocracy, the repudiation of a system in which only a king and a few of the king's cronies, called the aristocracy, have the rights to land, property, education, creation of wealth, etc. All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, we look at the founding of American democracy, and we certainly recognize, anybody can recognize just in purely historical terms, why this is a profound movement in terms of the political history of the world. But it was more than that. It was a profound movement forward and continues to be in its essence, in its principles, in the spiritual and moral development of the human race. And they knew that as well. So you have these men, quite a few of whom were slave owners themselves. Adams was not, for instance. Adams was from Massachusetts. He was anti-slavery. Not all of them were, but some of them were. Who themselves were slave owners, who say we're basing this on the idea that all men are created equal, and yet they themselves, many of them, owned slaves, did not mean women, and so forth. So the United States has always been this dichotomy. It is built into our DNA between these profound principles on which we are to be based. Now, it's important when we talk about these principles to remember, the founders did not give us these principles, which we will be discussing here tonight for their spiritual essence. They did not bequeath these principles and say, we are going to jump up out of the grave every generation and tell you what to do. That's not what they did. They said, these are the principles. You do with them what you will in your time. And in every generation, including ours, there are those who have said, we like these principles. We get the radicalism of these principles. These principles are amazing. These principles are so enlightened. These principles are illuminated. These principles are expressions of higher mind. Let's do this. Let's not just make it about white people. Let's not just make it about women. Let's not just make it about straight people. Let's really do this. Let's actually make this manifest. Let's actually embody this. Let's actually create a more perfect union, which would be the physical manifestation as best we can, generation after generation, of the principles on which we purport to stand. But there have always been those, just as there were those then, whose basic response to that was, oh, let's not. And these are people who honestly think the world is better off the other way. I mean, there were people then, and there are people today who honestly think it's better if you don't let everybody in there making all these decisions. It's really better if just a few people basically hold the control and the power. It's really a better way to do things. And that contest is as alive today as it was then. If you know these principles, they become tools, just like in the Course in Miracles. When the Course in Miracles talks about the principles of the Course are tools in your problem-solving repertoire. That is our power as miracle workers, is the principles that we know to be true, that we hold to be self-evident. And that is as true of a nation as it is true of a person. If you don't base your life on principles, you are at the effect of changing tides within your own appetite. And if we do not base our nation on these principles on which we purport to stand, then it's also just based on appetite. What you want versus what you want versus what you want versus what you want. That's a nation without principles. And a nation without principles is a nation without vision. And that which is most holy and good and true and beautiful in these principles do not fare well when you have too many people who don't actually know what they are. So let's go over tonight. Let's do what John Adams wanted us to do and revisit these principles. And revisit these principles as a way that we as spiritual seekers can do, and as the founders did in the realization of their larger import that went way beyond physical manifestation. First of all men are created equal. Radical. It was radical then, and it's radical now. And if you say that you stand on that, nothing can be the same. Are men created equal or are they not? Because if all men are created equal, then you can't have slavery. If all men are created equal, then you can't tell women they can't vote. If all men are created equal, you can't have institutionalized white supremacy and segregation. If all men are created equal with inalienable rights, a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you can't say to gay people, but you can't get married when getting married is their pursuit of happiness in many cases. So these principles are the foundation. It's not just that black people said, I want this. It's not just that women said, I want this. It's not just that gay people said, I want this. It's that we stand for something. And there's a big difference. One has moral authority, and one doesn't. That's why Martin Luther King, when he, on the March on Washington, said, we're not here to ask for new rights. We are here to cash a check. That check was already issued, but it has not been cashed in every case. And it's just in a nation, it's no different than in an individual's life. If you stand on a principle, it gives you what Martin Luther King called cosmic companionship, because you're bringing down that cosmic help. You are standing on righteousness, right useness. The word righteousness means right useness. And it not only, by the way, I think for our generation, it behooves us to remember that when the Constitution said all men are created equal, not only do we as Americans owe it to our nation to remember that doesn't just mean black, doesn't mean white, doesn't just mean straight or gay or men or women. It doesn't just mean Americans either. Now, second, also deeply spiritual in its import. Now, as far as all men are created equal, we talk about this all the time from a Course in Miracles perspective. A Course in Miracles says all of the children of God are special and none of the children of God are special. We say here all the time, there is nothing that you cannot do. The Course in Miracles says there is nothing that your holiness cannot do. That the people who have achieved the most on this planet have achieved a fraction of what each and every one of us are capable of. But, you hear me say it all the time, from a Course in Miracles perspective, the only way to not only remember that, but to affirm it and to practice it in a way that will actually serve you and serve the world is to remember this, that not only are you, through divine potential that lies within you, excuse me, not only you, through the power of the divine potential that lay within you, infinitely powerful, so is everyone else. This whole idea of all men are created equal. The Course in Miracles reminds us that there is only one of us here. That is what it means to say the sonship is one. That is why all men are created equal, because we are all created as one. So it is a deeply spiritual principle that underlies this political concept. Number two is related to it. E pluribus unum. Very, very big one for America, and one that is seriously up today. E pluribus unum means out of many, one. There are a lot of us, different colors, different cultures, different ethnicities, at least two genders, all that stuff going on. We have so many differences among us, but it's e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Once again, a spiritual concept. If you look at the aspen, do you know the aspen grove is the largest living organism on Earth? When you go to those huge aspen groves in places like New Mexico, it looks like there are thousands and thousands and thousands of aspen trees, but actually there is only one root system. So there are many, but we are united by our fealty to these common principles. That's why something like visiting these principles on July 4th is so important. You get to live your life and your culture and your tribe, go at it, have a good time. You get to live your tribe, your culture, go at it, have a good time. But none of that holds together safely. None of that holds together safely unless we remember these common themes and have common fealty. That's why that picture, that's why I love that painting, with all these people re-signing, as it were, the Declaration of Independence. In the Jewish religion, it says, every generation must rediscover God for itself. And the same is true politically. Every generation must rediscover these principles for themselves. It must be a fire that is lit within all of us. Now, this e pluribus unum thing is no small thing, because there are people in America today who seem to be so into the cultural differences, so into the ethnic differences, so into the religious differences, so into the tribal differences, that I think they do undervalue the significance of the fact that there are common principles on which we agree to agree. But then there are the other people who so want us to talk about our commonalities, but with an undervaluing of the diversity that is, in fact, the excitement of what America can be for people. So once again, this is not just, oh yeah, e pluribus unum. It is a very serious thing to think about. It is a very serious mental filter. You look at stories in the news. You know, one of the things talking about immigration today, these are not easy issues to grapple with. You know, we're living in a very, very difficult time. One of the things, for instance, many people say about many of the Muslim immigrants from certain countries, well, this is no different than immigrants who came from Ireland, or immigrants who came from Germany, or immigrants that came from Russia or any place else. Other people say, wow, we got to remember this. That was Western civilization traveling to Western civilization. Immigrating from Western civilization to another country in Western civilization is a much different issue than traveling from a whole different civilization to a new civilization. And the quest of our time, in order for the human race to survive, will be, can we avoid the clash of civilizations and instead have a partnership of civilization? You see this playing out in California a whole lot, about bilingual education. There are those people who say, if you have a child, you know, there are schools where, because of the laws, the state has mandated that the child must be taught in their native language, that would be unfair to the child if you didn't. But then there are other people who say, wait a minute. There has to be some way that people come here and don't just stay within their silo and seek to expand outward to be part of the commonality of our culture. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, this should not be a fight. It should be a great contest of ideas. It should be a great both and. But if you don't have enough of us understanding the balance we're trying to have here, then we cannot participate intelligently, and it is left to just a few people to decide for us, and that does not historically go well. Does that make sense? The third one is something you and I were taught when we were children. We were taught when we were in elementary school how many people came here for religious freedom. But, you know, when we were in elementary school, it didn't seem like a big deal because, like so many other things, we grew up thinking that these things had basically been settled. I mean, it's very nice what they did 200 years, thank you, we got it. Or people fought in World War II, thank you so much for fighting off evil, thank you, we got it. That was a mistake. And we're paying that price right now. And we're having to do some educational catch-up right now, because the only way we can participate powerfully is to actually learn and to remember in order that we can powerfully apply these principles in our time. I remember when I was in a European country, and I haven't done it in quite a while, but I used to lead these metaphysical tours. I took 3 trips to Egypt. This was before 9/11. It was different, had some wonderful times. And there was one time that I was leading a metaphysical tour, and we were in a European country, and I don't even want to say what country it was, but the group of us were at a public monument, but nobody else was around. And as part of our work together, I said, let's pray. And a policeman came over and said, excuse me, you can't pray here. And you know, sometimes you forget, because that could not have happened here. It can't happen here. And it's like so many issues where we just take some things for granted as the way they are. We don't even realize how significant it is that no policeman or policewoman could come in here to this church on a Sunday morning and say, we don't like the collegiate denomination. You're not on the list. They can't come in and say, Course in Miracles that doesn't go with officialdom. And that's what the separation of church and state is about. Separation of church and state is actually a very enlightened concept. It was not placed in our Constitution by our founders in order to suppress the religious conversation, but in order to protect the religious conversation. That the government shall pass no law that limits your religious freedom. As Thomas Jefferson said, a man can believe in 20 gods or in no gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. It doesn't hurt anybody else. It doesn't take anybody else's money. Go for it. And, you know, once again, we thought we were growing up. It was like, oh, we get it, you know. Everybody can be whatever religion here. And now, once again, like I said, these symptoms morph, ladies and gentlemen. We think, you know, greedy Caesars aren't around anymore. Tyrannous kings aren't around anymore. Yes, they do. They morph as people, as institutions, as policies, and so forth. For us to know that this is a sacred first principle, religious freedom in this country. No law, when Congress is deciding laws and policies, no imam, no rabbi, no priest, no minister gets to walk in, as they can walk in some countries. Take a country like Iran. You know, you can have the president and you can have the official bodies declare policies, but if the supreme religious leader doesn't like it, it's nixed. We don't have that here. No policeman can come in here and tell you and me how to pray or not to pray, or we have to pray or we don't have to, whatever. They just can't tell us that. And no religious leader can go into the halls of Congress and say you have to pass this law or you can't pass that one. Now, once again, this is a spiritual concept. We know this. It's just like the Course in Miracles makes it so clear that it's only one statement of universal spiritual truth. There is one truth, and it is spoken in many different ways. And one of the things that we can see in our own lives, how many of the truths that we discuss here about A Course in Miracles are also discussed in very secular language, where people don't even invoke the name of a higher power. And that we know in our own individual lives that this makes a difference, that nobody can come in and tell you where you have to go. This is freedom in your mind. And when Thomas Jefferson, I have sworn eternal hostility to any chains upon the mind. This is so big. And the issue here is that when this democracy was founded, as imperfect as it was and as imperfect as it still is. The idea is that this would be a place where, to the best of our ability, self-actualization will be possible. That's why gays should be able to marry. That's why you can't have slavery. That's why you can't have segregation. That's why you can't have institutionalized white supremacy. That's why you got to give women the right to vote, because everybody gets to do what they want to do here, because that is from the mind of God, the freedom and the liberty that is much bigger than a political issue. It is an issue that has to do with whether or not human beings get to spread their wings. I will never forget when I heard Muhammad Yunus, the founder of the Grameen Bank, speaking about the very, very poor. We have 1 billion people on this planet who live on $1.25 or less a day. That's where you get your 12,000 children a day who are dying of starvation and so forth. And he likens the deeply poor on this planet to bonsai trees. Now, that was very, very powerful, because a bonsai tree has everything that a huge tree has, but it's encased within this little glass box. So it simply can't get out. You know, for those of you who were at Sister Giant, John Fugelsang has made this wonderful movie about revisiting the American dream. And there was a man there, and I can't remember his name, the man in the movie. He's kind of a famous character here, actually, in New York City. I think with the Harlem School Zone, I'm not sure. But he gives this eloquent talk about the difference between some of the children here in New York City who are growing up in some of our most disadvantaged neighborhoods. And he talks about how these are no different in terms of their ability, their innate abilities, and their intelligence, and everything that is just bursting to get out of them than some kids who grow up in the richest neighborhoods of this city. So this idea of the idea that we would, to the best of our ability, create a society, manifest on earth a world where people working hard have the ability to spread their wings. Now then, that fourth principle speaks to that, however, and that has to do with the rule of government. You might say, all right, this company wants to create a product, all right? And this company wants to create a product, and they're going to employ a lot of people, and they're going to manufacture the product, and they're going to sell it, and a lot of wealth is going to be created. And that's freedom. Economic wealth is really important, too. In fact, it's a large part of freedom, because money is a large part of what enables you to put food on your table. And as Franklin Roosevelt said, freedom doesn't mean freedom from want, freedom from fear. And you want freedom from economic despair and stress, which is certainly an issue in our time. Now, the government, the principle here is that government will broker individual liberty, where people get to do whatever they want to do, and concern for the common good. We're seeing this right now. We're seeing it right now. So we have an EPA, where the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, all of its scientists say Dow Chemical is manufacturing a pesticide that is absolutely known to cause brain cancer in children. And this is so dangerous that this should be permanently banned. And then you have these other forces currently in power who are saying, no, just deregulate. What's important is the market. What's important is people being free economically to do whatever they want to do. And so they are now saying, in contrast and overriding the rulings of their own scientists, that Dow Chemical will be allowed to sell that pesticide. Now, this is in the courts right now. But if you don't know that principle, then you don't know that this contest is an eternal contest between individual, which in this case goes way too often in terms of corporate freedom, economic freedom, versus a concern for the common good. But once again, this is not just political. This is not just economic. This is spiritual. This is about life. This is about the 10 Commandments. This is about Jesus, that we should love one another. This is about the fact that there is something beyond just you doing what you want to do. God didn't send Moses to deliver the Israelites from Egypt and then just lead them to the promised land. Something bigger than that went on. During the trip, not that long after they left Egypt, as a matter of fact, God said to Moses, come up to the top of Mount Sinai, I want to talk to you. And in this state that he went into, through fasting and days alone with God, he was given through illumination the 10 Commandments that he then wrote on a tablet. To love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy might, and how we are to live. God doesn't, it's not just about the highest spiritual mountaintop is not just do whatever you want to do. We talk about that all the time. The top of spiritual mountaintop is do what you want to do, but always within the context of being good to one another, radical goodwill. So the idea that there should be this first principle by which the government would broker this contest between individual liberty and the common good. You see it with the guns as well. You have a Second Amendment that says right to bear arms, which I do think was, I think the conservatives are correct about where the founders were coming from. They didn't want the government to be able to have all the guns and not the people. So they put for the purposes of a well-organized militia. So some people say, well, we're fine with, right to bear arms, but there are the issues of common good here having to do with child locks, why some people feel that the average person should not have assault weapons, et cetera. So the idea here is that when you know what these principles are, look at just having discussed them here tonight, how much more empowered we are as citizens. Because if you don't know what these principles are, you don't know the context for these great political happenings going on in our country. If you don't know what these principles are, you read about regulation versus deregulation, but you don't know the principle at the core of the contest. You read about various things, and you don't, when you read about the freedom of the press and the freedom of the media, why Jefferson said you have to have a free press and you have to have free public education for a purpose. And that is because the governance of this country, and this goes back to a deeply spiritual principle. When you and I were kids, we learned about the kings of Europe and that the sun god, right? The divine right of kings. We learned this as kids, but what does it mean to you as a kid, divine right of kings? Well, the repudiation of that is that it's not the divine right of kings, it's the divine right of you. And the divine right of you, and the divine right of you. And that instead of the divine right of the kings, where God is giving power to the king to lord over people, God is giving power to all the people who will then lend authority to their freely elected representatives so that it's a democratic republic. Once again, this is spiritual in nature. This is not just what we think of as political. And so Jefferson said that if you don't have a free press, then people don't know what's going on, so they don't have anything to base their decisions on. If you don't, and that's why an attack on the media is so significant. This is more than just you getting what you want or me getting what I want or CNN getting what it wants or anything like that. And that's why Jefferson also said we need free public education, because without free public education, people will not have educated critical thought processes, so they won't know how to think well enough to base their decisions. There's no accident why slaves during slavery were not allowed to be educated. It was against the law to teach a slave to read, because once people know how to read, once people are educated, once people have critical thought processes that are educated, they have power. And so any attacks on these things are attacks on the principles on which we agree to stand. Now, as we were reading from Adams, and you can look, I love the internet, just go read brainy quotes, read the famous quotes, spend the evening tonight when you go home. Read some of the great quotes by John Adams, by Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and they're gonna mean something to you. It's like the Course in Miracles when you're reading, and then one day it's an aha and you get it. It's like geometry. I remember I was not great at math, but so I remember particularly when all of a sudden I would get the theorem. I didn't get it and then I got it. A principle in the Course in Miracles, you don't get it and then you get it. And same with these principles at the heart of what happens here. Now, one of the things that we know, this, people in 12 steps know this, people who have ever been to the gym know this, you can never let it down. You can never, if you're a Course in Miracles student, you don't get to go through the workbook once and then go, well, I'm so cool now, right? It's coming back. It's always coming back. It's always coming back. That's what every African American knows. That's what every Jew knows. That's what everybody, to some extent, is a descendant of some formerly disempowered people. So first you have slavery, and then you have institutional racism, segregation. It's back, and then so first you abolish slavery, and then it's back, and then you have the institutionalized white supremacy of the American South. Then you have the civil rights movement. Now you have chipping away the civil rights movement, mass incarceration, all the issues. It's back. That's why being educated is so important, because then you know that, oh, the forms change, but we must always be on the lookout for those greedy Caesars and those tyrannous kings. And today, as much as at any time in our history, we should remember that the revolutionary fervor of 1776, the cry of the patriot's heart was hell no to tyranny in any form. And I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, today, in 2017, the cry of the patriot's heart should equally be hell no to tyranny in any form. That's what these secretaries of state are saying. No, you cannot have the information about the voters. No, you cannot have their IDs. No, you cannot have the last 4 digits of their social security numbers. And you see, these are Republicans as well as Democrats, because these main issues are not left-right. Privacy is a serious issue. Once somebody has all that information on you, this is the road to voter suppression, because there are all kinds of ways to make people feel, you know, maybe I just won't show up because I just won't take the chance. You know, they're going to know me and they're going to know. Hello? And so it's more than I don't want. And that's why I'm proud of these secretaries of state. And they're Democrat and they're Republican. I think more Republicans probably than Democrats. I'm not sure about that, but it might be. It doesn't matter. The point is they are standing for a principle that has nothing to do with left and right. And the last thing I want to point out that's related to that, political parties are not mentioned in our Constitution. Political parties are not mentioned in our Declaration of Independence, and they're not mentioned in our Constitution. And you might want to look up on the internet and read George Washington's farewell address, because he warned us against them. He said, beware the power of factions that will come together and make the power of the factions more significant than the power of the principles and the power of the people. And, you know, if you look at the history of the United States, third-party voices were so important. Abolition came from the Abolitionist Party. And women's suffrage came from the Suffragette Party. And what has happened is there's been a kind of unholy alliance between Democrats and Republicans, whereby it's been made very, very difficult for third parties to have their voices, the real lifebloods. Now, I'm not saying what the answer is here. I'm not saying we should I'm not saying anything, actually. Because as Rilke says, sometimes you don't know the answer, you live with the question. But when you know what the issues are, you live more intelligently with the questions. So what's happening in America today is that we are constantly bombarded by meaningless issues. We are constantly distracted by ultimately unimportant things. It's on the internet all day, every day. It's on television all day, every day. It's part of our media and our cultural conversation all day, every day. And it's sucking the juice out of us. And you have to actually decide to be a deep thinker in America today. You have to actually lay claim to your own higher self in all kinds of ways. When you see things like civics not taught in the schools, history not taught in the schools, art taken out of the schools, when you see all the ways, these great contests, they're a part of very, very important things, and it is so easy to be distracted. It is so easy not to engage in even thinking about these things, because it kind of, you know, it's like makes my head hurt, right? But it's what grown-ups do. And ultimately, we say here all the time, you know, people say, oh, it's so sad when a child has their childhood, they're robbed of their childhood. Well, these days, we're letting ourselves be robbed of our adulthood. We're letting ourselves be robbed of the maturity. You know, when the Lincoln-Douglas debates was something like they debated for 2 hours, and then they went and had lunch, and they came back for another 2 hours, something along that line. People actually were more politically literate, those who were allowed to be politically literate in our country in former times than today. And today it's too often just sound bites. Nobody really wants to sit there for the deeper conversation. You know, well, if it's about religion or politics, we're not going to talk about it. I'm always like, that so leaves me out of dinner. I mean, because we have developed a taste. It's like cheap food. It's like living on candy bars. It's like there's intellectual nourishment, just like there's physical nourishment. And you get sick if you only eat junk food. And you get de-spirited if you only live on junk ideas. You know, sometimes it's important not only to read the newspaper, it's important to read a good book. And you know, I write metaphysical books, that's lovely, but you know what, sometimes in our crowd, read a good novel. Read a great novel, read great poetry, watch great films. We're not feeding ourselves enough with the things that really expand our consciousness. And the things that expand our consciousness are not necessarily just about us. Everything falls apart in this country if we think it's just about us. And that is the basic corruption of both of our political parties, who basically say, if you come with us, we'll give you this. If we come with us, we'll give you that. You're a woman, we'll give you this. You're black, we'll give you that. You're Latino, we'll give you that. And we all have to ourselves hold that, you know what? It's more than me. It's not enough that I will get what I want, because if we don't get what we all need, you know, you've heard me say it before, I don't care what public issue it is, it will make its way to your private door. You might think it has nothing to do with me. Food is a perfect example. Well, I'm gluten-free and I drink green juice and all that kind of stuff, so somehow I can live inside a bubble and it won't matter that they are poisoning the earth, or they're poisoning the air, or poisoning the water, not even to mention the moral issues involved, and the fact that some of our citizens who are the poorest among us do not have access to that good food, and even if those stores were there, they could not afford it. We stay infantilized if we make it only about us. And we make it infantilized in terms of the spiritual community too. I feel so strongly that those of us who can see these issues through a metaphysical lens have so much to bring to the party. Because so many of the people who are having the political conversations don't have this more expanded spiritual perspective. But sometimes it seems to me also that those of us with a more expanded spiritual perspective lack just the basic tools and the basic issues of political perspicacity. And you know, I'll tell you something. You can, and I know this from my own career, you can take somebody who has a basic knowledge of how politics and government operates, and you can't just give them a larger spiritual perspective in a weekend or two. But people with a larger spiritual perspective, this stuff, everything I said here tonight, it's not hard. And it's actually quite interesting. You say it all the time, politics is like a soap opera. You don't know what's going on, but you're sick, and so you're home with the flu. You turn on the remote, and you turn on a soap opera, and you don't even know who these people are, and who's she, and what's that, and you turn it off. But the next day, you're still sick. You don't have anything else to do, you take your remote, turn it on, it's that same soap opera. Same people, you don't know who they are, but you're about to go into the other room to get yourself a glass of water, and you notice that same lady, and you're like, oh yeah, she's his mother. About 4 days later, you're like, oh my God, she's having his baby. You're hooked! And let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, once you really allow yourself to embrace this information and realize how deep it is and how much it matters, and how your ancestors, whoever they are, for an African American who knows slavery and what that meant and what you owe honoring your ancestors and protecting things for your descendants, or a Jew who knows what happened in the Holocaust, or any people, because no matter who you are, you know, if you're black in America, if you're an African American in America, then obviously your ancestors did not come here seeking a better life. But if you are anybody else, they sure did, and sometimes to great sacrifice, and no matter what our color or ethnicity, we are all to be part of this franchise here. We are here now, it belongs to all of us. And just that realization, it's a very grown-up realization. And grown-ups show up. Grown-ups show up. And this is a time in our nation's history in a way that I don't think any of us would have ever expected, when we are called upon, as much as any generation before us, to show up. And we're not going to be able to show up, though, unless we grow up. And we're not going to be able to grow up until we remember the principles, very mature principles, very grown-up principles. As I said, not only political in nature, but spiritual in nature as well. The Abolitionist Movement emerged from the Quakers, and the Civil Rights Movement emerged from the mind of a Baptist preacher So behind all the great social justice movements in the history of the United States, behind every single movement deeply forward when America has swerved from our own first principles, there have been those who, because of a religious and spiritual basis, looked at that which was not good, was not aligned with the principles of the United States, and felt it so strongly because it was not aligned with their understanding of God as they understood God. If, in fact, there's an inner light within every man, woman, and child, as the Quakers believed, then slavery is intolerable. If God created all people equal and we are here to love one another, slavery and segregation are intolerable. That gives you power. The Course in Miracles says miracles arise from conviction. And just book learning doesn't give you conviction, but spiritual understanding and spiritual faith gives you conviction, and that gives you the power. And it gives you the capacity to remember that sometimes love says no. Love doesn't just say, oh, well, you know, it's not for me to judge. Oh, please, grow up and know that sometimes love does say no. And the other half of that is not only that love gives you the power to say no, love and faith also gives us the power to invoke that which we know can be. That is the power of faith. Faith in possibility. And that is what the first principles of the United States give us, a context for faith on this earth in possibility. And that is a spiritual principle. The Course in Miracles says, heaven and earth shall be as one, means that one day they will no longer exist as two separate states. The Course in Miracles says you are here to create the good, the true, the beautiful, and the holy. And that doesn't just mean in your head, it means right here, right now. And as Americans, we have an opportunity to do that as much, and in many cases more, than the citizens of any country in the world. And when the United States gets it right, it is tremendously important on this planet. And when the United States gets it wrong, unfortunately, it's tremendously significant as well. It's our turn. Jefferson's out there doing whatever that spirit's doing. Adams is doing whatever that spirit's doing. FDR is doing whatever that spirit is doing. Martin Luther King's doing whatever that spirit is doing. Bobby Kennedy is doing whatever that spirit is doing. Abigail Adams, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It's our turn now. It's our turn to own our yes and to own our no. It's our turn to stand up. It's our turn to grow up. And it's our turn to show up. And you know what I always say that means. It's our turn to kick ass. Thank you very much, and happy July 4th.